Hello Harja, agus fáilte go ddíonchiad a granile seo de Blúiríní Béaloidis agus agran speisialta na Nollaig. Inis agus tús na mísa builtelinn híl ma héin agus mo hóleací Jonny. Hello Jonny.
Hello.
Go mu teáilte go leor díúiste ar himsaíart agus sprí na Nollaig, agus roint cíú dhéanú ar na nósanna agus na tradiisiún a bhain le féle mór na bliana seo, féle mór na Christiarta. Féle tá seanhaithe a chud rútaí sete go dóin i gréin na staige at le na bhain príocht airthaí go fáil ina bhicin muid fues agus ferber tegóní. You join us for a very special festive edition of Blúiríní Béaloidis today, folks, as Jonny and myself set out to take a critical look at one of the most prominent and beloved festivals in the Irish calendar year, Christmas, Regeneration and Nollaig. Now overtaken somewhat by the rampant commercialism of the modern age and held for ransom by an overweight home intruder with a penchant for mince pies, this midwinter festival has transformed in recent decades. But this transformation is nothing new. The story of Christmas and the festive period, as we'll come to see today, has long been one of change and rebirth. From its pagan roots as a midwinter festival of worship and propitiation of the gods of the natural world, to its rebirth as the Christian celebration we recognise today, its journey tells a very human story of a people looking to a volatile, uncertain world around them and seeking desperately for meaning and security. Much like we're still doing today, Jonny.
Indeed.
I think.
Every day.
Quite appropriate. Looking for light, metaphorically and figuratively speaking, in the harsh darkness of the long winter season. Although much of the early traditions have long since faded and newer associations have taken their place, as happens, and rightly so, as always with folklore, but there's still a great deal of this ancient symbolism and evidence in our modern observances, if we know what to look for. Patterns which can be traced not only across the island of Ireland, but further afield internationally as well. And that's the beauty of folklore, as we always say here, don't we, Jonny? In that it provides the key, if you like, to look at these practices to unlock a deeper understanding of why we do the things we do when we do them. Why do we light candles in our windows on Christmas Eve? Why do we choose holly and ivy for decoration? Why do Kerry men dress in masks and wander the streets on St. Stephen's Day with a dead bird, while Finns ride abroad that day on horses? Or at least they used to. Curious yet, Jonny?
Mm-hmm.
Good, that's what we like. So in the hour ahead, Jonny and I hope to get you all in the festive spirit with the answer to these questions, as well as with some other, we hope, surprising and perhaps thought-provoking ideas about this familiar festival, all at once ancient and yet still full of youthful exuberance, a bit like ourselves. Marked by light and darkness, I don't know why you're laughing, Jonny, marked by light and darkness, endings and new beginnings. So let's begin at the beginning and head back to the pagan revellers of yesteryear, as they celebrated not the jolly old Saint Nick, god of gift-giving we know today, but rather another figure, Saturn.
Fantastic. Well, I think for the longest time, the winter kind of solstice period has been one of the most important festival traditions in Europe, not just in Northern Europe, but across Europe and further afield even. And so lots of the customs and traditions and the details that you alluded to there and pointed to, they come from this fantastic kind of panoply of different customs, and some of them pagan, some of them pre-Christian, some of them kind of Nordic and Germanic traditions and folkloric traditions and so on. And it's the combination of all these things that are kind of in the synthesis that live with us today. And when you start to pick them apart, it's fantastic, this kind of strange tapestry of saints and deities and Roman gods. And
we've had such
Germanic
fun,
gods.
haven't we?
Oh, it's amazing. It's fantastic. It's so interesting. But there's something quite moving about it, a lot of the symbolism and stuff that I find as well. Overall, I suppose, like you were alluding to there and mentioning, the kind of the message at this time, I suppose, and you have to imagine it in the context of pre-industrialized society, where there's in winter the days are at their shortest, the kind of darkness reigns for this period, and around the time of the winter solstice, it's a period of enormous celebration, and the idea of the victory of the sun over the dark, the unconquerable sun, Sol Invictus and so on, and the idea of the return of the sun, and the general census or the general consensus largely having been that the roots of the midwinter festival lie in a kind of fertility rite. Basically, this is the kind of the idea that seems to manifest basically, and so the main festivals that Christmas comes to us today, and you can see the earlier kind of roots in two pre-Christian pagan festivals. One of which is Saturnalia, and the other of which is Yule, the kind of the Nordic pagan tradition. And so Saturnalia is this kind of hilarious, some of the kind of aspects and components to it, period of kind of orgiastic revelry and a kind of undoing of the social order, basically. And this was a festivity that was dedicated to the god Saturn, who has a kind of long and complex history really in Roman tradition. And the god Saturn was believed to live under the temple of Saturn in Rome. And on the 17th of December, this festival ran from the 17th to the 23rd of December. So it was a kind of, there's a week-long kind of festivity largely. And on this day, on the 17th of December, all kind of normal activities would cease. Schools would close, law courts would close. And people on that day in particular had to forego their kind of the normal attire, and they'd wear these tunics. They'd wear kind of casual wear, basically. But not just the ordinary people, the great and the good would do, the senators and politicians. They'd have to wear the kind of the lowly clothes. So everyone was kind of normalised across the strict kind of caste system was kind of undone. That the high dressed like the low, basically. And as additional to that, they also wore this kind of conical leather cap, the peleus, the liberty cap, which is where there's the magic mushrooms are often called liberty caps. They have that kind of bell, kind of golden shape to them. It's from this old hat.
I don't know what magic mushrooms are, Jonny.
Well,
what are you talking about?
It's a name that's still used today. It's the liberty caps for these.
Really?
Kind of,
I've never heard of it.
So the peleus was like this kind of leather cap that was worn by freed slaves to show that their status, that they had been slaves, but now they were freed slaves, and they'd wear this cap. But on Saturnalia, on the 17th, on the first day, everyone in Rome would wear these caps.
Oh, so there's this great sense of democratization, is there?
Yeah,
on that
there's
period?
the undoing of the kind of the strict rigor of the social order is kind of undone, basically, and so master and slave, the lines are blurred, basically, and so on that day at the temple of Saturn, a huge crowd would assemble. A priest would make a sacrifice to the god, and then some of the senators would step forward and they'd take an enormous wooden statue of Saturn and they'd walk it down to the Roman Forum, to this open area where there's huge banquet tables and everything set, and they'd lay the statue of Saturn on a couch, a kind of reclining couch, and then they'd commence these festivities. And so you'd have thousands of people out in the square having this enormous feast with Saturn kind of overlooking the whole thing. And Saturn is the god of kind of the crops and of wealth, and the word kind of satiated, to be satiated, kind of comes from Saturn, this kind of term of fullness and bounty and so on. And so an enormous feast would commence. There'd be kind of eating and drinking and so on. There'd be gladiatorial exploits, but they again would invert the normal social order. You'd have women gladiators fighting each other, or dwarves and so on and so forth, right? So it was this kind of strange scene that people kind of gathered to watch. And you'd have all aspects of the social caste mingling together on this day. And then after that, people would kind of engage in parties and revelry throughout the night.
Would this last for that period, the 17th until the 23rd?
But this is the first day so far.
Oh God, so this is just the first day.
Excuse me. This is day one.
Day one.
There's quite a way yet to go. So the revelers would lurk through the streets, basically, in drunken revelry. And the greeting that they gave to one another was Io Saturnalia, and you'd call back, Io Saturnalia. This is the kind of greeting that everyone gave at this time. Then there would be parties in the houses. There would be the king of Saturnalia would be Saturnalica's princeps, I think. The king of Saturnalia would be elected at the party, but it was often, say, the slave or a child who'd be elected, and they'd be the king, and everyone had to do what they'd say. But they'd say kind of joke things like, let's drink some more, or everyone do a stupid dance or something like that. It was all kind of in good humour, basically. Slaves would have their dinner served by their masters often, even though they'd have to make it themselves. Or master and slave would eat together, and the formalities are kind of broken down. There's a sense of goodwill. There was an enormous sense of gift giving. People would purchase what was called the sigillaria, these little waxen dolls that you'd get for everyone. But everyone had to get a gift from everyone. There was an enormous amount of gift giving, of calling from house to house.
One gift per person.
It was everyone you would expect to get one, and everyone you'd have to give one, basically. These little gifts. So there's this process of giving and exchanging these gifts and calling around from house to house and feasting and excess and revelry. So the overall theme you have, I suppose, is this loosening of the social bonds, and that's something that's very common with calendar custom, where you undo the ties that bind, but you do it to reaffirm them, kind of, and you can engage for a brief period of time in behaviours that you'd never be able to usually. So that was one of the kind of characteristic aspects of Saturnalia, this sense of feasting, of excess, of revelry, and on the 19th, I think, of December, they had the feast to Saturn's wife, Ops, where you get the term kind of opulence and so on from, and she had a festivity towards kind of crops and so on in the year, but there was also a feast day to her to give thanks for the grain that was all stored in the barns, and people would have further excesses and more kind of food and so on and so forth. So lots of the aspects of kind of the loosening of the social bonds, a sense of kind of goodwill among men, as it were, gift giving and travelling from house to house, and the kind of revelry manifests from Saturnalia. And that was kind of instituted as an official, the largest kind of Roman holidays. And those customs were then brought by Roman invaders to places across Europe and Britain and so on. So you see those customs begin to...
Because they're very familiar already to us, aren't they? The feasting and going from house to house.
Yeah, they are.
The revelry. We'll see that again as we go through the hour.
Again and again.
That's interesting.
And there are strange things to link in the Saturnalia to again, it's always interesting to see how these aspects link in even to older festivals or even in Indo-European traditions. There is the Mahabharat, which is the Hindu winter solstice festival. And there's a reference in the Journal of Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland, a journal from 1915, and it mentions a kind of tenuous, at least, link, or a small link, which is interesting to note, at least, of this similar sense of this role between master and slave, a hierarchy being undone in the very rigid Hindu caste system, where the Brahmin and people from the Sudras, the highest and lowest castes, would kind of struggle in this symbolic struggle as part of a fertility rite. There's a piece here. It says that the rite was held at the winter solstice in December. It was not a festival of sowing, but one intended to quicken the fertility of the earth, and one of its chief features was the dance of the maidens bearing pitchers of water. No one would expect that a Vedic rite, duly ordered by the Brahmins, would present us with the license of the Roman Saturnalia as recorded in the texts of Augustan and later periods, but even in the completely formalized version of the Vedic texts, there are traces of an unexpected prominence of the Sudras. Those are the lowest of the low, the lowest of the castes. The maidens are dasis, female slaves, and an Aryan strives with the Sudra over a skin which is shaped to be a symbol of the sun. So the noble, someone from the highest caste, struggles with someone from the lowest. The Aryan is, of course, victor, but the mere fact that the struggle occurs shows the popular character of the rite, and its open and avowed fertility magic deepens the impression. So there's the idea that even in this Hindu midwinter solstice festival, there's a reference to kind of master and slave struggling with one another in order to bring about this kind of fertility magic as this symbolic idea. It's an interesting kind of side. It's difficult to posit any huge
True, as some things are, but it's interesting to note, isn't it?
But it points as well, I guess, even to the fundamental importance of the winter solstice as this hugely important period for our forebears, for our ancestors. Even if you look beyond Saturnalia and Mahabharat and Yule and so on, back to the people who lived here thousands and thousands of years ago, across Great Britain and Ireland, across Europe, and the stone circles or passage tombs like Newgrange is aligned to light up at the winter solstice.
And Stonehenge.
Exactly.
Because we just see the significance it must have had for them.
Exactly that. And you can imagine the sense of the kind of the return of the sun, basically. So that's I guess in many senses, the symbolic kind of character. On the 25th of December in Rome, you had Sol Invictus, the Unconquerable Sun. There was the kind of feast day of the god of the sun, basically. And that has connections then to again later Christian tradition and trying to map these on to pre-Christian
which we'll come to, won't we?
Yeah, in a tradition. I mean, that the birth of Christ wasn't celebrated until much later, in an attempt to kind of co-opt and incorporate these kind of pre-Christian and pagan traditions. But the overall theme that we see is one of kind of regeneration, goodwill, and an upending of the social order in Saturnalia.
And the return of light as well.
The return of light,
Do you see that in Saturnalia? I know we see it much later and again in our kind of modern traditions of the emphasis that we would have placed on the symbolism of candles and lights and candles with Saint Lucia in Sweden.
Yeah.
But do you see evidence of that in Saturnalia?
Not explicitly, but what you do see is, again, on the 25th of December, you have the Roman feast dedicated to Sol Invictus, where you have the day of the Unconquerable Sun, and that's that celebration. It's after that period where there's the celebration of the return of the Unconquerable Sun, this kind of unquenchable flame, this light of lights, basically. And I think that fundamental importance, again, because these kind of symbolic mythic truths are ultimately related to very, very deep expressions of being in nature, are born out of a response to nature and the natural world, and then they become, that kind of wisdom becomes incarnateness and manifests as these symbolic expressions, basically. So
because we take so much for granted in the sense that we've got electricity and we've got...
Absolutely.
So now to us candles are quaint little ideas, but even before candles, they were in darkness.
And you can imagine, I mean, the time...
Or you can't even imagine
it.
Yeah, I suppose,
yeah. I mean, but how much of the day would have been in dark, how little work could be done.
And in the northern hemisphere,
Absolutely.
the further north, can you imagine how little sunlight you would see?
Yeah, ice and cold and snow and dark. This is that time. I remember chatting with a friend of mine not so long ago when the electricity went in our house in the winter time. We were sitting in the kitchen chatting by a candle, had a great chat for a couple of hours, and by the time it was done, I thought, God, what time is it now? Is it like 11 o'clock at night or something like that?
Yeah.
And it was 8 or half 8. It felt totally pitch black outside. It felt like time for bed. You know, everything kind of shuts down when you remove this kind of the electrical light and so on. That kind of endless honedness of the modern world, whatever. A very different rhythm begins to take.
And how we regulate time and perceive time. Yeah.
And we've only been doing that for a very, very recent span of time. If you think about our overall evolution, whatever. Which is why when I come to power, I'm going to ban all electric streetlights. It's my first official move.
We have a lot of plans for this dictatorship, Jonny.
I do.
We must discuss that in a later podcast.
Indeed.
So shall we move on to the practicalities of Christmas as we know it and as our forebears would have known it? Christmas practicalities were a reality in the past as they remain so today. In the days and weeks prior to the festival, early preparations would begin. It's kind of something that we still do. Today's the 1st of December as we're recording this. It'll be available at the beginning of December, but already we're thinking about Christmas presents, Christmas feasts, Christmas parties. So it's a season that brings a lot of festive good cheer, but a lot of heavy lifting and logistics for kind of older members of the family as well. So our forebears would have had this in mind as well. Homes would be thoroughly cleaned and prepared, with many going to great lengths. I've read accounts because we actually have a questionnaire in the archive on Christmas. We have 3 full volumes and then 2 kind of minor volumes. So actually such interesting material for those who are interested in the broader calendar custom of Christmas. But people went to extreme lengths in the recent past of even whitewashing their homes at this period of time, which I don't know if you've ever whitewashed, Jonny, but it is a godforsaken practice. Horrible. Especially at this time of year, I found it quite surprising that they would do this when the weather is so tempestuous that it could actually have a deluge of rain at any moment. And there's nothing worse, believe me, than watching your hard work wash down the street. Really,
it's whitewashing your house in lashing rain.
Exactly. So to me, it was amazing that they would do this kind of more than once in the year, but to actually do it to Christmas inside and out. Then you've got obviously the preparation of clothing, laundry, all the furniture inside. They would have prepared their best delf for the season ahead. And the Saturday before Christmas, we're told in our manuscripts here, was referred to as Lion Margumor, or the day of the big market, where people would travel to their nearest town to buy their food supplies, I suppose, ahead of the festive season of Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, to get their meals, and sweet treats would be baked. And as well, we've got to remember that we are absolutely gluttonous now in our modern traditions of the food that we eat and just the consumption of food, whereas before they were quite mild by comparison. They wouldn't necessarily have turkey, they might have goose, they might have beef, was apparently very common. Some of them even reference fish, but I can't remember. I don't think they would have eaten it on Christmas Day, but that fish would have been prominent. And again, I suppose it's just using what they had and what they could afford.
Yeah, I guess if you look to certain Yule or Saturnalia celebrations, you see rampant orgiastic excess. So you can look at some Yule customs that describe the massacring of animals and horses, and people smearing themselves in the blood and eating just enormous amounts of meat. So
do you know when people ask you
thing has been
what period in time you would like to return to, and some people say the 1920s, and some people say, oh, I'd love to be at 1916.
Yes.
You'd probably go straight back, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think I would, yeah.
Probably would.
Yeah,
I
probably would, yeah.
Grand. So while we leave you there in your revelry, to finish up on the kind of the preparations and the practical side, animals would have been slaughtered and ready for the meal. But also decoration is a hugely interesting topic, which people would say, right, you throw up a $3,000. Yeah. But actually, when we began looking at the symbolism of this, there were some curious points that we thought we'd kind of pick up on. So bringing greenery indoors, it's not something new, but it's something that is a custom of great antiquity and has great symbolism. Evergreens were seen as a symbol of undying life, we're told, in the kind of the academic articles that we've been reading, holly, ivy and mistletoe are probably the most commonly used Christmas decorations, and they are very much seen and were seen as life symbols, evergreen, and the fact that they bore fruit in winter as well as being an unusual trait gave them a greater weight, I suppose, in symbolism. So holly with its berries was seen as a masculine symbol, bringing fortune and fertility apparently to a household, while the ivy was feminine and considered a luck symbol. Had you heard that?
I had read that as well, yeah.
I
hadn't heard before, no.
Yeah, I'd never appreciated before this. And what I quite enjoyed, I'll read you this.
Is this the male and female, kind of the prickly holly and the smooth holly?
Yes, and that she could hang up as breeches.
Oh,
yes.
What's that?
I love it. So this is a reference that I found in a 1987 article about customs and beliefs associated with Christmas evergreens. And it said that it was customary in the 17th century in parts of Oxfordshire for the maidservant to ask the man for ivy to dress the house. And if the man denies or neglects to fetch the ivy, the maid steals away a pair of his breeches and nails them up to the gate in the yard or the highway.
Brilliant.
So that's a high price to pay, so just get the ivy, Jonny.
Just get the bloody ivy.
Just get the ivy.
Yeah.
And the thing just to note as well that we really don't think about anymore, and just how quickly we proceed with these customs, is that it's always interesting to look who would collect the decorations, who would bring them to the house, who would hang them, when would you hang them? Would you hang them on Christmas Eve? Would you hang them a week before? Was it the youngest member of the family or the oldest member of the family? And then also, interestingly, what comes across from the academic work as well, and also from the questionnaire that we have here, is how would you dispose of them? And this was hugely detailed in the responses, in that some considered it bad luck to throw them away at the end of the festive season when you were taking them down after the Feast of the Epiphany. But elsewhere in Europe, it was considered... So in Ireland, they would burn them, but actually in Northern Europe, for example, it was considered bad luck to burn them. Rather, you were to leave them outside or just gently throw them away, because, again, seeing them as a life symbol, to burn them was just an ill omen, really, for the year ahead. And it's this whole idea, as you were saying earlier, about kind of building up this idea of fertility and luck for the season ahead. And people were very careful to observe those customs in respecting kind of the evergreens, that they brought luck to a house, and you weren't to kind of undermine that luck then by ill-treating them. Yeah,
it's a part of the process of symbolic reasoning, I guess. These aren't just items or objects or plants that are coming into your home. They have a secondary meaning, a deeper meaning. They point to something else. And that's the sense of, as you mentioned there as well, like who collects them, or at what time are they put up, and when are they disposed of. These aren't just, you don't just get it randomly at any time, put it up and take it down. Like there's a kind of abstract framework that you have to work within, to ensure that this kind of symbol is given proper representation, and that you don't undermine the force that it's going to manifest in your own house.
Absolutely.
Could I play a piece here from that references a lot of what you just described from Bill Egan?
Perfect.
The Midlands. This is collected by Jim Delaney, and it's a nice little piece where he describes decorating the house and kind of preparations in advance of Christmas.
For up to Holly then and Ivyville. When you had all whitewashed, painted, cleaned, and every bit in the house cleaned, the next thing then I'd go up, you get the holly then. Some used to go mad to get the holly with the berries on. Yeah. More wouldn't pass on their marks and they put up any sort of holly.
Yeah.
And then if you couldn't get holly, they used to get old ivy leaves.
I see.
But very few would get ivy leaves, except where there'd be old people that had no.
I know.
But
where would you put the holly, Bill?
They used to put the holly in everywhere that they could get a sticky branch in. They'd put it round the rack, into the mugs, round the dresser, over the fire, in the window, and round the lamp. And if there was a blessed picture in the house, they'd make a little cross of the holly and put it up over the picture. I made several of it. Make a little cross to see the picture of the holly and just hang it over the Sacred Heart.
I see.
And you put two little bits in, one each side of the picture.
I see. That'd be nice.
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
It was grand to see a little cross made of that holly.
I never saw it now, Bill. I must sketch it and make one of them.
Oh, they're the grandest of you, see.
Who used to go for the holly, Bill?
Well, young people in the house, children used to go for it. It was easy got about here.
Yeah.
You hadn't to go far for it at all, just across the river here in Ballyduff. You could bring home a nice load of it you want.
I see.
Well, at the present time now, there's a holly tree growing here below and into my own field.
I see.
But it's only a young tree. We don't cut any of it. We're letting it alone.
I see.
It's growing up in the side of a drain.
Mm.
Well, then it's up the road here. You can get it up in the hills on the amount of it.
I see.
The holly will be left up until the 12 days will be over.
I see.
And after the 12 days, then the holly will be all taken down and burned.
I see.
We used to go more to see the dry holly blaze.
Yeah, make a great blaze.
The Thorn.
Yeah.
So he would burn his holly.
He'd burn it, yeah. That was the comment. And again, I mean, you can see as part of that, although it might be bad luck in another place to burn it, it's quite a specific, careful way, in a sense, to dispose of a symbolic item. That you'd bury something or you'd burn it. You don't just leave it rot by the wayside. You dispose of it in a very specific way with fire, which is a kind of, life force in and of itself, or whatever, or often be tokens of life force. So you can see, despite the variability of these customs, that there's a kind of emotional or symbolic logic behind it, that you can't just get the holly and just throw it out the window after the 12-day period. You have to dispose of it in a certain way so that it's correctly gathered and it's correctly disposed of, because it's a symbolic item. It's not just a thing, just a kind of empty material heap of
Greenery.
Greenery, yeah. It points to something else, and like you were saying, that especially Bill makes mention then of kind of the idea of holly with berries attached to it, that which flowers in midwinter when the world is asleep and the world is dead. Well, you want to incorporate that as part of these celebrations for the return of the sun and the return of or the promise basically of abundance later on, basically.
And to touch on that point, one of the things I discovered that I'd never come across before was the Holy Thorn at Glastonbury.
Oh yeah.
Have you heard about this?
No, I hadn't. You mentioned this yesterday, yeah.
Fascinating, because to me Glastonbury means music festivals, but really Glastonbury in the southwest of England, it is kind of a renowned site of British pilgrimage, and not just in the musical sense, which surprised me because that was very much my association, but it's been, or it was a pilgrimage site, a great pilgrimage site of the Middle Ages until the Reformation dissolved it. And
the Reformation.
The Reformation. It all went downhill. But one prominent myth that's associated with Glastonbury is this, character, we'll call him for the sake of this legend, Saint Joseph of Arimathea, who brought Christianity, it said, to Glastonbury and planted there a holy thorn. So some of the legends vary. Sometimes he planted the thorn, but also there's an idea that he placed his staff on the ground from which sprouted this evergreen holy thorn, which blossoms in spring, but then also, interestingly, as you were saying about this idea of blossoming in midwinter, it blossoms on Christmas Day as well. And it's still a tradition that's observed annually. I've kind of gone and looked it up and read a few articles about it, and they take it very seriously.
Good.
They, quite right, we love a bit of tradition. And it's a calendar custom that's observed every year. They cut a part of it. They retell the story as, again, this kind of affirmation of tradition and the, I suppose, renewal of community ties, I suppose, in a way as well. And then sprigs of it are sent to the Queen each year, apparently, and it's been done for generations.
Amazing.
But it's this idea that the Holy Thorn is very much a part of Glastonbury's kind of vernacular Christian culture. And it still grows at Wary Hall Hill. If you're ever there, you're more than welcome, I think, to go and see it. Just that you don't touch it because they get a bit...
And rightly so.
And rightly so, I suppose, that they get a bit temperamental if you start ruining their natural heritage. But it's there, it flowers on Christmas. But one of the interesting things was, we were speaking, I think, in one of our podcasts before about the change in the calendar from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. And there was a period just as it changed, I think in 1752, the calendar changed. And everyone was waiting on Christmas Day for it to bloom, and it didn't. It actually bloomed on the 5th of January as if it was adhering to the old Christmas calendar. And they were like, well, this is obviously...
Like the monks on Skellig the Hill.
Yes, exactly. So
That's
they're like,
brilliant.
they're obviously, this whole new calendar's a load of codswallop. But
That's fantastic.
yeah, so this idea of the evergreen and about the natural world and working with what you have and the symbolism of that and fertility and growth in this midwinter festival is something that very few people would probably think about when they think about Christmas. It's all about the M&S ads and... I know, but so interesting just to bear those things in mind.
It's fantastic, and actually the holly tree and attitudes of the holly tree in English tradition bear some relation to the nervousness with which the kind of the skeach or the hawthorn or whitethorn is treated as the notion of a fairy tree or supernatural kind of a tree with supernatural inhabitants. There are similar customs or traditions relating to the cutting down of holly bushes, and that you don't do that. And I was reading even a piece from a woman in the 1980s, and she was describing how they had cut this down, but they left it hidden in a laneway outside their house under other rubble or material, so that people wouldn't see that they'd cut a holly bush down, because there was a general reluctance to kind of go near this tree and interfere with it, in the same sense that that you find often in Irish tradition relating to the whitethorn tree or the fairy tree, the tree that looks as though it hasn't been planted by a human hand, it stands alone in a field, this kind of thing. But that's fantastic. I'd never heard about that. I didn't know about that at all.
And to finish up on that, we have the Yule Log, which or Blúiríní Béaloidis, which would have been very common in Ireland. It used to be a piece of a fir tree that would have been burnt at Christmas, and again, the idea of the ashes would be used for divination around this period as well, which is kind of a common motif in Ireland. But yeah, a lot of kind of the natural world coming in to the interior home at Christmas. And one of the things I love, there's a reference here from one of the questionnaires on Christmas Eve this is from County Clare, where the gentleman writes, Chini Morna Nollaig, about 5 p.m. or 6 p.m, an enormous fire in the kitchen would be lit with a huge block of what he calls goosh, which is fir. And the rosary would be said then. Christmas greetings would be exchanged after the rosary. But what I particularly love, usual rosary, and in brackets, with trimmings.
Oh, excellent.
Said later on. So there's this idea of practical preparation for Christmas, but there's also great spiritual preparation, as in the past, that there would be a huge amount of rosaries and additional prayers said at this time, and people would be encouraged rather strongly to attend Mass regularly.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Even those who very kind of rarely frequented the doors of the church.
Indeed, darken the
hardy usuals, they'd have to go.
Yeah, exactly.
So, a lot of practical and spiritual preparations for Christmas.
It's a particularly interesting aspect of it. I mean, even Yule is the other kind of major area from whence are received the majority of our Christmas customs and traditions as they manifest today. I mean, like you mentioned, the Yule Log, and that has a particularly kind of old derivation, and there are kind of references to it. But as well, I suppose there was the idea that this was a kind of fertility symbol that was kind of chopped down and burnt. And Yule, I thought that the initial reason that we had a kind of the 12 days of Christmas was an account of the shift between the Julian and Gregorian calendars, and that the date shifted, and that's why it turned into a kind of larger phase. But it actually comes from Yule was a 12-day festival that was celebrated at a midwinter festival. Typically, Yule was understood really to occur somewhere between November and January, and there was no set kind of date as far as I'm aware for it. But it was Håkon the First, the king of Norway, who Christianized Norway in as late as the 12th century. So it's much later than Ireland, so it was in the 5th century, whatever. Kind of assigned it to the more Christianized kind of date, which itself was set by Julian I, the Pope in Rome, who set the 25th of December as the birth of Christ that would then be celebrated, which wasn't celebrated. There's no scriptural kind of basis for this celebration, but it was an attempt to incorporate these kind of pagan and pre-Christian traditions. But at Yule, there were the fertility rites and magic. There was the burning of the Yule Log, a huge kind of log that was cut down from a tree, from the fir tree, as you mentioned. There were sacrifices made, and often to the kind of female mother spirits or at the time. And so there was Mother's Night in Germanic tradition on the 24th. That was the festival that was observed. Bede, the medieval English historian, mentions that in the 8th century. He talks about Mother's Night celebrations. And so this is the kind of the indigenous midwinter festival observed by the historic Germanic peoples. It's connected then with Wotan, with Odin, who's the kind of the leader of the wild hunt, the kind of the master of the Furies or whatever. He was sometimes called Yulnir or Yule Father, the Yule Father or Yule One. And so there was kind of these kind of connections or celebrations in connection with this kind of midwinter festival. There's a fantastic quote from the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson, who writes in around the 11th or 12th century. He describes the kind of the Yule customs, basically. He says that it was the ancient custom that when sacrifice was to be made, all farmers were to come to the heathen temple and bring along with them all the food they needed while the feast lasted. At this feast, all were to take part in the drinking of ale. That'll do. Also, all kinds of livestock were killed in connection with it. Horses also. And all the blood, he goes on to describe then, all the blood was smeared and sprinkled about the temple, and the walls inside, the walls outside, on idols, and likewise on all of those present. And then it says meat and animals, and the animals that had been sacrificed, their meat was boiled for feasting, and blessings were made, and toasts were drunk to the gods, but also to departed ancestors. So you have a slightly more blood smeared version of the rosary occurring there, insofar as spiritual preparation at a certain time, and a period of feasting and excess and divination and kind of fertility magic and so on. And so, I mean, even for example, the Christmas ham as a kind of Christmas food tradition, that's from Yule.
Really?
That kind of is that incorporation in England. I think it's even in parts of, is it Oxford maybe? I could be incorrect, but in England, as far as I'm aware, they would eat at Yule a pig's head. Not just the pig, but the pig's head. So this is kind of, there's a symbolic aspect in
And
this
there's
sense
something
as well.
in the north as well about a boiled ox's head that I read.
So that's, I guess, as part of this kind of these Yuletide celebrations. Again, your Christmastide, Yuletide, this 12-day period, Saturnalia is this kind of week-long period, this midwinter solstice period. That was also then, that was looked down upon with very kind of, again, there's often that tension between aspects of folk tradition and the formal church, of Christian church especially, where they try to kind of quash and quell these practices. But you have, say, you have the presence of Roman soldiers invading Britain and bringing with them the customs of Saturnalia. You have the indigenous midwinter festivals of the Germanic peoples celebrating Yule across Scandinavia, and Iceland and Norway and England and so on and so forth. And so you have this kind of panoply and tapestry of kind of pre-Christian, pagan and Italic and Nordic customs in this giant mesh that go together today that we don't think to pick apart. Why holly?
No,
why the Christmas
never.
ham? Why the log? Why this? But they point back to so many disparate kind of expressions and symbols and so on. But that point largely are kind of born out of nature and of the in particular, I suppose, the customs and traditions and reactions to being of the northern peoples of Europe, basically, in many ways. But in the references to kind of to Christmas and celebrations of Christmas and the kind of orgiastic revelry and rioting that often occurred in the streets as well was looked upon very dimly by those of a more puritanical spirit. In 1652, I think it was 1652, the execution of Charles I, Christmas was banned. And under the protectorate that was, when Cromwell was the kind of the protectorate of the Commonwealth, Christmas was outlawed as this kind of, just this kind of degenerate pagan feast that had nothing to do with kind of with scripture or Reformation or whatever. That lasted maybe until 1658 or 59, I think, when people just demanded that it be brought back. But the descriptions of Christmas at that time in England and so on were these kind of just orgiastic, murderous revelry, basically, as opposed to kind of goodwill, and it's not the kind of Dickens Christmas Carol.
I see.
But that lasted, then that spread across to the kind of the Plymouth Brethren and New Englanders in America, who banned Christmas for hundreds of years, and viewed it as this kind of totally awful and kind of pagan feast. I have a quote here from, if I can find it, from a certain reverend who where is he gone? Yeah, Cotton Mayfair, who in 1712 had a Christmas sermon, says, "Can you in your conscience think that your holy Saviour is honoured by hard drinking, lewd revelling, and by a mass fit for none but Bacchus or Saturn?" Right? So he's like, this is kind of an awful kind of carry-on. And it wasn't until in the mid-19th century that the last kind of states lifted their ban on Christmas. And it was often through the kind of Sunday school reformers, where they were trying to fill the pews by teaching children about Christian doctrine and so on, of the Protestant perspective, that they got them often to reenact the nativity. So that kind of nativity scene tradition comes from the Sunday schoolers trying to kind of inculcate a sense of Christian tradition
a very
in the children.
specific agenda.
It did, and kind of proselytization and so on, but that was what kind of, I suppose, broke the back of it in the US. That and Charles Dickens, of course, Christmas Carol in 1867. He had this big tour of America, giving all these speeches and reading A Christmas Carol in these kind of packed theatres, whatever. But which had a kind of huge popular impact in the manifestations of Christmas today. But if you look at the Christmas tree as a Germanic tradition, the bringing in of holly and ivy is a kind of broader European tradition. The use of mistletoe has long had these kind of divinatory practices attached to it, medicinal practices attached to it. It was associated with the Nordic pagan god Balder. He was the most beautiful of all the gods.
And
he was
it's
killed
all
with
he
mistletoe.
and this is where Loki comes into it, that this was the only instrument he could use to kill Balder, son of Freya.
Yeah, he was
again-
also honoured at Yule.
Yes.
So from where we get, of course, Friday. You know,
And
we
we've
have
come
and
across
both
her
on
before.
Wednesday, Thursday, Thursday. You have these kind of all of these echoes of the past reverberate in the present all around us. But if we can familiarize ourselves and make ourselves aware of them, then you begin to see, you know, where they come from, and it's a fantastic but a kind of overwhelming process. Really, just this combination, all this symbolism, and kind of, I would say, an artistry and beauty and wisdom that manifests at this time between the kind of evergreens, the thing of Mother's Night, propitiation of the ancestors, fertility rites, prayer, feasting, excess, and inversion of the social order and of those kind of norms or whatever, and that kind of symbolism, the light in the dark. You know, that's what this is at this time, I suppose.
And that's a lovely way to bring us to our next point, actually, light in the dark, where we'll draw in on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And we might talk about the candles, which are a huge aspect of the Christmases of yesteryear. And again, as you were saying, bringing light to the darkness and the symbolism of that. And so on Christmas Eve, it was a great tradition, as it still is. Do you still do this?
We do,
We
yeah.
do this at home, where we light candles in each of the windows on Christmas Eve, and we do it again on New Year's Eve, but it was something that was done on New Year's, or on Christmas Eve. Excuse me, I'm picking up your cold now. It was something that was done on Christmas Eve, on Christmas night. They did it on New Year's Eve, New Year's Day. They did it on...
Really, in Donegal.
No, this is just in across the country. Depending on the questionnaires I was reading, it was something that was done in a number of nights during the festive season. And sometimes it would be 3 candles for the Holy Family, or sometimes you'd see references made to a candle being lit for each member of the family. And it was this idea of welcoming the Holy Family symbolically on the night when they were wandering, to say that you're welcome here, there's a home for you here. And also some of the recollections in the manuscripts that we have here speak of it being a welcome to the ancestors and those who've passed away as well. That on Christmas Eve, when everything is prepared, the house is left tidy at night and the door would be left unlocked, which I do not recommend you do now in modern Ireland, but everything would be left tidy, a meal perhaps or food left out, and the door left unlocked for those who were looking for succour and comfort on Christmas Eve night.
I have a piece recorded here, Patrick Fortune, material recorded from him, where he describes kind of the singing of Christmas carols and so on and so forth, but also this widespread tradition of leaving the candle in the window.
What's this you're going to tell me?
This was in the old place in Charlotte Street.
Yeah.
When we had used to have a crib, the brother used to get up a crib and electrify it, have it all filled with electric lights, and the lights going in and out and stars at the back. And they usually every Christmas Eve, the family used to gather around the crib, and we used to sing Christmas hymns, the Deste, the Dalis, and Noel, and Silent Night, and all the Christmas hymns.
Yeah.
That was a Christmas. I used to light the candle in the window.
Used to.
You lit the candle in the window, big candle we had, big white candle. Used to light that in the window, and we would. At 12 o'clock at night, on Christmas Eve, we used to sing hymns around the crib. And then that morning, the next morning, we used to go to First Mass in 6 o'clock. The First Mass, yeah.
Why so early?
And, oh yeah, well that was just a custom, you know. It was the custom to get First Mass 6 o'clock.
And what is the meaning of the candle in the window?
Oh, it means our Lord, you know. The coming of Christ. Oh, that's a custom of the years, having that, especially on the country too, in the houses, in the windows facing the road, you know, showing the light of the family coming into Bethlehem.
I think it's a beautiful tradition.
Oh, I love it.
I like that it
Absolutely love it.
continues.
Yeah, same here.
But
it's,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's just like I say, it's just the beauty of the symbolism of it. I mean, you have the idea of these kind of wanderers in the dark, the Holy Family, kind of Our Lady, Joseph, and so on, looking for somewhere to go. But the idea that the extending of a welcoming light, a light in the dark, to kind of, I don't know, illuminate the way. And even, Patrick mentions it in that tape as well. It's again, it's a symbolic component. You're not just lighting a bloody candle. It's something deeper to it or beyond it. There's a secondary meaning, which is the ultimate kind of function of this thing, where the candle is placed in the windows facing the street. He says that it's for everyone to see. It's a kind of public thing, whatever. And at this time, again, even relating to, the return of the sun, the light that burns in the dark, the sense of the victory of light over dark, or life over death, or truth over ignorance, whatever. This kind of idea manifests not just in Christian tradition, where you have kind of Christ as viewed as the light of the world and so on, but then in with regards, again, the return of the unquenchable flame of Sol Invictus, the Unconquerable Sun. This kind of the symbolism of the light and the dark, I think, is something profound for that kind of, I suppose, speaks to a very fundamental kind of component of being, in relation to being, and kind of struggling, but this kind of illumination in the midst of all that. And even the context of Christmas Eve, this is late on Christmas night, so before Christmas Day, which was typically known as Mother's Night in the Germanic and pagan traditions. And you can see maybe that, in the context of incorporating those traditions into the Christianized kind of framework and doctrine, that you have this idea of Our Lady travelling around at this time. And so again, there's that reference to kind of to the sanctity or the divinity of motherhood and femininity at this time as well, and how that expresses itself. So there's a kind of just this general tapestry of symbolism and a synthesis and a combination of these varying kind of symbols that have a deeper root in the natural world and in nature as it expresses itself at this time, but reveals to me, and it reveals this symbolic truth. Tradition is synonymous with the kind of truth in that sense, you know what I mean? And so you can do something as simple as lighting a candle in the window, but it speaks to something far deeper, and it's just, I think it's so beautiful as a kind of, as a symbol, but so many of these things are at this time.
But I love on the 7th of January, it'll be doors locked, curtains closed.
Oh, good luck.
Ring me before you come.
Yeah. A giant kind of bleak January awaits, yeah. But for now, wanderers in the dark are welcomed in, the door is open, and there is a light that never goes out, to quote Morrissey. Never thought I'd quote Morrissey.
Oh, well, there's a first time for everything.
I'll have to edit that out.
But one of the things that I picked up on there from the tape was this idea of going to Mass in the morning, and we were saying this, we used to go to midnight Mass in Donegal, which hilariously we still go to, but it's now at 11 o'clock, but we still call it midnight Mass. But you would go in the morning.
I always went to the early Mass in the morning, yeah.
And critically, you didn't get to open your presents until you came back.
It was the custom in my house where we'd go to right up in the morning, off to the early Mass, so maybe 7:30 or 7 even, back to the house. My father would cook a breakfast, and after that, one got to rip into one's gifts. I could never understand the unbridled kind of joy of many friends just like up and into their Christmas.
Absolutely.
Like, no, it has to be tempered by all manners of hours of early Mass, hours and hours of Mass, and then that was the thing for us. Yeah, the first Mass, and then back, and then breakfast, and then
self-control was very admirable in your house, Jonny.
Indeed. Well, I'm
I
not
was
sure about that.
up and out of bed at 4.
Were you really? Yeah. That's amazing.
Just that sense of anticipation.
Oh, it's so exciting. It's
and wondering
so exciting.
if you'd been...
I remember as a child, waking up and there's some little gift at the end of the bed or some little thing kind of in the night. This was often left at the end of our beds as children. There'd be like our parents would leave some
that's
small
a bit disconcerting.
No, it was great. It was so exciting. You'd wake up in the middle of the night like, and there was some little kind of present there.
So Father Christmas is wandering around the house?
Well, I suppose it was kind of, it wasn't tempered with any sort of paranoia. It was a very benign and pleasant scenario.
Well, we're going to touch on the very famous Saint Nick shortly, but before we do, although we take him for granted and await him anxiously each year, one of the great hilarities in the manuscripts was the idea of when he first came to Inishbofin and how he frightened the women folk there. And this is actually one of our followers online who found this, so a big,
lovely.
Yeah, it was lovely, so a big thank you to her for unearthing this. But I'll just read it out quickly. And this is collected from Niccolo Doohan by Shena Hohay in 1944, and it's in Irish, but it's this idea that Santa, Father Christmas, was not a phenomenon known in the early 20th century. So this is when he first came to Inishbofin. Ní ró le omra Santa Claus na rúime sin hat na Harbí. Níor thuúla mo wahéir na duinear béalad na seanhaintir treachta na gró omra ar lihéad a Harbí. Bhí mar Easter in Ilan seo san am, agus go leor acu na réige na Ilan Rio agus na facail borl acu, agus níor thuúla siid omra in an nearhhuasla seo a bhí le hart nuas simla Io Nollaig, go dtí gur thuúla siid maistras na scalaí cante. Waidjin waie dúrú ban acu le vanile. Nelas gon go dtí sort fada le hart nuas ag na poistí Io Nollaig a Harbí. And it's this lovely idea of the strange man coming down the chimney that's just introduced by the local teacher and the old women of the island who'd never probably left the island
brilliant.
and had never spoken English, wondering, oh my God, who's this strange man coming into the house?
Yeah,
it's hilarious
that's
because
incredible.
again, Saint Nick is a very a new-ish idea, really.
Yeah, in this part of the world, yeah. I mean, the kind of I suppose Saint Nicholas of Myra has had like a lot of kind of dedication and devotion to him as a saint in this country and elsewhere. I mean, there's the Church of Saint Nicholas of Myra on Francis Street in the Liberties in Dublin's inner city, which is a beautiful church. But he was known as Saint Nicholas the Wonder Worker. There was lots of kind of miracles attested to his intercession in tradition, basically. And again, then in the kind of apocryphal sense of tradition, in the folk religious expression. So apart from the canonical dictates of the church, he became associated with sailors, with children, I think even with merchants, with repentant criminals. Even I think he was a kind of patron of, basically. But he became associated with the idea of kind of secret gift giving, and he also became a patron saint of children. There's a story about there's a famine and a butcher lures 3 children into his house and he promptly butchers them all and he has them in a barrel and he's curing them to make them into pies, basically, as you do. And so Saint Nicholas comes along, sees through this and punishes the man and regenerates, restores, revives the children to life. And so it became associated with the kind of this thing of children, the protection of children in a sense, basically. But there was also another narrative told of Saint Nicholas where there is a poor man with 3 daughters and he can't afford a dowry for any of them, which would mean that they'd be kind of, outcast in society at the time, basically, or regarded as prostitutes or kind of the lowest of the low. So this man is kind of greatly dismayed about this, and the story goes, or one of the variants at least, that the good saint, on the night before each of these girls come of age, he throws a purse full of gold coins through the window for each of them to kind of to so that they have a dowry, so they can have their rightful place in the kind of social hierarchy, whatever. And the father kind of cops onto this at the last time of after it's occurred twice, and he waits. And so to kind of to get around this, Saint Nicholas drops it down the chimney, and she has a stocking hanging there. It falls into the stocking, this kind of golden purse of coins. So you have references to motifs again of the chimney in an early kind of medieval legends about this saint, and the stocking. Why do we have a Christmas stocking hanging off to the front? What's that all about? You don't even think about these things often. True. But it has its kind of roots in this this figure of Saint Nicholas, this kind of who's wandering around Asia Minor and Turkey and Egypt and Palestine and so on and so forth, but then in Europe becomes associated with this kind of miracle worker and patron saint of children and secret gift giver. And again, in the context of gift giving of Saturnalia and the kind of liminality and the strange kind of period that manifests at this midwinter festival, he's become a symbolic figure. And then also with kind of emigration to the United States, then becomes kind of, as has happened in so many traditions, like with Halloween and the Samhain festivities, you have kind of emigration to the United States, and then where those traditions take root, and then they're kind of projected back. They're projected back in a variety of kind of expressions into modern kind of contexts as well. But many of the celebrations around Saint Nicholas, I mean, in Austria he travels around on the 5th of December. I think his feast date is the 5th or the 6th of December when he's believed to have died. But in Austria, the good saint travels around with the Krampus, who's this kind of malevolent figure behind him. This
We've
goat.
heard about him.
And he has this kind of basket and he brandishes sticks at young children and he kind of frightens them or whatever. And then there are varying kind of songs sung that, like, Krampus is going to leave you alone this year because you've been good, and Santa Claus is going to, or Saint Nicholas is going to give you these gifts and give you sweets or cakes or whatever. But there's that idea of punishing those children who are bad and bold, and then rewarding those who are good again. But with reference to types of behaviours that aren't usually condoned or don't usually kind of occur in the everyday context. So in Austria, this is called the Niccolo Spiegel, this kind of little dramatic kind of play, similar to something that we have, a much more kind of benign or innocent maybe version, well, a little bit anyway, to what we have in Ireland, the mummers play in particular. But this people would come in with mantles of straw and wearing huge antlers, and would have a kind of a large whip as this procession would move from one house to the next. So you call in from house to house, a mixture of these kind of demons and saints, entertaining the people therein, terrifying the children, giving them little rewards and so on. That's part of the liminality of this kind of phase, of the in-betweenedness of Christmas and the midwinter traditions and all calendar customs. They can be imagined as a kind of an axis point or a hinge upon which the world turns and our perspectives all shift. But there's a huge amount of kind of a huge focal point of lore and custom and tradition and symbolic expression that often finds itself in total opposition to what the normal modes of being are. So people are anonymously travelling around from house to house, or again in Ireland we can look at the mummers tradition where or with the Wren boys on the 26th of December who go out in honour of St. Stephen and so on, that you have these people men wearing women's clothes or women wearing men's clothes, or there's debauchery, revelry, there's kind of intemperate speech, there's drinking, there's music and so on and so forth. But it's part of this wider framework where we break the ties that bind us in order to kind of strengthen and reaffirm them. But there's like a loosening of all the social kind of caste and hierarchy. You kind of just take the lid off the pot for a while, but then put it back on.
Yeah.
You do it in a controlled way, and people forget that, I think, about the nature of traditional societies and conservatism of tradition, that built into it is this kind of subversive element, but it's built in at specific points and it's used to reaffirm the overall structure. You can't have an endlessly subversive doctrine of your own culture or whatever, as you could be said today, in a sense that is the case in many ways, but that in these instances, these breaks are kind of, they manifest in order to reaffirm the structures and the ties that bind.
And we see that across Europe, because in the articles that we've been reading, we see it in Newfoundland, who have had a very strong mumming tradition.
Mm-hmm.
We see it in Mexico in what they call the Posada time. So again, this idea of going from house to house, these processions, these performances. We see it in Greece as well, where they had this period from the 6th of December to the 24th called the Kolianda period, again of carols going from house to house. We see it in Sweden with the festival of St. Lucia, and that's on kind of begins the Christmas season on the 15th of December. And again, it's this idea of dressing up this person representing a symbol of light. And again, it's just this idea, as you said, of breaking away from the norm, undermining the processes and the systems, but all with the greater purpose of reaffirming them later on and kind of beginning the new season.
Beginning again, yeah. I mean, it's worth maybe mentioning briefly as well in the context of Irish tradition. Apart from the mummers play, we also had the Wren boys, and the Wren boys would go around on the 26th of December on St. Stephen's Day, and St. Stephen was regarded as the first Christian martyr, who was kind of betrayed by the Wren. It was said in certain traditions that soldiers were looking for him, and that the Wren gave away his hiding place, and he was subsequently stoned to death, as martyrs are. But the idea this day was that young men and boys would often travel around the hedges and so on, and they'd catch a wren at this time, and they would go from house to house dressed in strange clothing and singing songs and so on. And I suppose they would entreat the occupant of the house to give them money to bury the wren, quote unquote. This is kind of, and they go around brandishing a holly bush or a bush of some sort with the wren often dead and kind of tied to it or pinned to it or whatever. But the wren, again, is this kind of combination and strange synthesis of Christian and pre-Christian or pagan traditions, where the wren there are references in Aesop's fables from around the 6th century BC. There was a reference in Aristotle, I think, to this particular story of Aesop's that mentions the contest for the king of the birds, and all the birds in the world decide to have a competition to see who's king, and the eagle basically is kind of soaring high above the rest, but the wren, the kind of treacherous wren, has tucked himself away under the eagle's wing, and when the eagle is at its absolute height, the wren pops out and it's just slightly higher, and so is promptly declared the king of the birds. But he's then kind of punished for his treachery as well, in that it said that he could never again he always has to exist at hedge height. He can't really go beyond that. But the names for the wren all over Europe are things like Basileus or Winterkönige or Hedge King, Winter King, or just King. They reference this kind of,
in Irish.
It's strange that the Drolene and then the wren, and they don't have this kind of reference to his kind of kingship or whatever. But this is a kind of, again, at this time you have the use of this kind of treacherous bird, but a kind of people going around loudly in the mornings of St. Stephen's Day from house to house, entreating the occupants for money. And sometimes, if they didn't give them money, they'd bury the wren in front of the the house, basically.
Which was an awful ill omen.
It was an
for
ill
the
omen,
year
yeah,
ahead?
yeah. But we have a small piece here that describes the catching of the wren, the putting of them in this kind of in a jar, and then walking around the town from town to town, or from house to house, excuse me, in the townland. And then there's a kind of the rhyme that's kind of sung at each of the occupants of the house, basically, as these boys go around.
Ah, brilliant.
And then when St. Stephen's Day came, of course, we went 3 or 4 miles with the ran, and you put them in the centre of a bush. You put them in the centre of a piece of a holly bush. We went around the house, and I never did it, but I knew lads if people didn't give them money at the house, that they took the ran out of the jar and buried them in the ground. They put a spell on the people, a curse on the house. I never done that, but I knew fellas to do it. If they didn't get money at that certain house, there was a rhyme that sang, the ran, the king of her birds, sees the day she was caught in the fur. Although she is little, her family is great, rise up, my laddie, and give us a thread. My brogues are worn, my clothes are torn, body in the ran, there's 3 long days or more. Up with the kittle, a down with the pan, give me my money and let me be gone.
And to finish up on St. Stephen's Day, it's worth noting that in Finland they have St. Stephen's Day, but called Panny's Day.
You mentioned that. What's that?
Again, it's this procession of boys, we're told, that would have dressed up in straw, and they would have had the Tupani figure of St. Stephen, the first martyr. And he would be either ride on a horse or be pulled in a sleigh, pulled by a horse, and they'd visit houses and perform a song and dance.
Seriously?
Yeah.
A little effigy of
St. Stephen.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and again, it's fascinating that they have a ballad, the Ballad of St. Stephen, or the Song of Tupani, that they call it, that apparently was influenced by English tradition. And again, it ties in with this idea of St. Stephen taking or having the Scandinavian god Frey?
Yeah, he was associated with a certain deity.
Yes, so I think it's again that idea of superimposing a very old idea onto this newer St. Stephen and the god of fertility and his association with horses, which in Finland we see them being, or they would have traditionally been raced and sacrificed to appease Frey, and now they continue to have this link with St. Stephen in that he would ride around on a horse or be pulled in a sleigh by a horse, and all the artwork and the iconography of St. Stephen's Day in Finland has this very strong association of the horse as being the one who sees the first star to tell St. Stephen that Christ is born.
Amazing.
Yeah, really.
It's incredible to think, when people think about, kind of Christianity did paganism in and so on and so forth. Paganism, it peeps out from behind so many aspects of Catholicism in particular, in the saints that become, that take the role of these deities, and the kind of the synthesis of these things, these energies carry on, these echoes reverberate and they carry on. The symbolism maintains itself, and that it might be kind of not clearly known by people, might be kind of ignorant in many ways of these traditions or their deeper meanings or origins, but these kind of forces of these deities and pagan figures and so on aren't gone, but those living waters still run through often the worship of saints and other figures who manifest in popular tradition. And aside from then the Wren Boys on the 26th of December on St. Stephen's Day and Boxing Day and so on, the mummers' play was a huge part of the Christmastide festivities. And this is something that's still practiced, as is the Wren in many parts of Ireland, but the mumming tradition, which comes from, I think it's Old French, like miming, to mime. A mummer could be an masker or somebody in disguise, basically. But there's a kind of hilarious play that would enact in a kind of mock battle between a variety of characters. Who would you have? Cromwell would often feature, Prince George,
St. Patrick,
Beelzebub,
the
Big
Turkish
Head,
Knight.
the Turkish champion, the Turkish Knight, Big Head, Dilly Doubt, Johnny Funny. It's this amazing kind of raucous, slightly macabre, kind of grim and very boisterous and violent kind of mock play where these figures are introduced one after the next. The Doctor, of course, is the main character as well. The hero comes in, the champion comes in, he's slain by his opponent. The Doctor comes out and he pronounces a kind of a rubbish nonsense magic over the hero, who then he revives. The champion goes on to fight his opponent, is victorious, and then Johnny Funny often goes around to collect the money from a jar. and then there's music and dancing and singing, and that music often would be, or the money would often be gathered up from that, and used to kind of put on the mummers' party, that would take place and that people then would kind of generally assemble and attend to. But they'd call in from house to house, they'd burst into the houses making raucous noise and so on and so forth. And it's kind of the breaking of the normal ties, but part of that broader European tradition of kind of house visits, of Christmas visits between the Niccolo Spiegel in Austria, the mumming scenario, the Tapani that you mentioned in Finland, even in the Saturnalia there's a kind of case of travelling from house to house, and that sort of manifestation is one of the key components of this kind of Christmastide midwinter folk tradition.
And we should say mummers are known more in the north of Ireland
and the east,
whereas wren boys are more to the south.
Yes, in Munster and so on, and so the mumming traditions would be a borrowing from English and British kind of tradition. You see some of those figures like Prince George and Cromwell, or it might be in England, say Prince George against the dragon as the opponent, but then in Ireland it might be St. Patrick versus Prince George. There's an adaptation. I mean, in more recent mumming festivities, you'd see people like Saddam Hussein or George Bush or Tony Blair.
Updated it.
Of course, yeah, because it just points to these kind of mock figures. But there are hilarious references, to the Battle of Waterloo and battles in Flanders, and Prince George talking about beating the Dutch here and there and the Turkish champion coming. So you have these kind of mid-19th century kind of little rhymes about these kind of characters as they go about their business in this kind of semi-maniacal little play
approach. But we see when we're digitising the scrapbooks, I've been going through one recently, and mummers are appearing a lot, and it's this idea, as you were saying, that it's a masking tradition. So it's not necessarily always associated with Christmas, because there are references in the scrapbooks of competitions, kind of mumming competitions throughout the year, where they would put on shows, but at Christmas there was a particular, I suppose, script that was associated with Christmas, because Father Christmas would appear.
Yes.
And a hugely popular tradition.
Indeed, yeah. I have maybe a piece to end with as our treat from the archive from the mid-1980s, the Blúiríní mummers in County Fermanagh, who are kind of a troupe, and there's a 4.5 minute, quite hilarious kind of piece of them as they go about, introduce themselves, and then kind of begin to engage in the sing and dance and revelry of Christmas time.
Well, we shall leave our listeners with just the best festive wishes.
Indeed.
And we'll see you in the new year.
We shall. We have to bid Io Saturnalia, God Yule, Merry Christmas.
Banachtaí na Féile.
Gadíreach é.
And we'll see you in 2018, hopefully. Happy holidays.
Delighted. Good buzz.
Right.
It's going to go over an hour, I'd say.
Yeah, but you're maybe
but
for
it's Christmas.
It's alright.
That'll do us.
Come on. Here comes my house for the Christmas. I wish you all a Merry Christmas and the right New Year with pocketfuls of money and barnfuls of beer. Room, boys, room. Give us room to rhyme. We'll show you some activity about the Christmas time. That's the young and that's the age. The liquor after what could be acted on the stage. And you didn't believe the words I say. Come on in, Oliver Cromwell, and clear the way.
Here comes I, Oliver Cromwell, as you may suppose. I conquered many nations with me long copper nose. I made the French to tremble and the Scottish for to rue, and I beat the Jolly Dutchman on the plains of Waterloo. If you don't believe what I say, Edwin Jack Straw, he'll clear the way.
Here comes old Jack Straw, such a man you never saw. I kicked the devil through a rock, through a reel, through an ice spit and wheel, through a bag of pepper, through a miller's hopper, through a cheap shank bone. Such a man is never known. You don't believe the words I say, enter in Green Knight and he'll soon clear the way. Here comes I, Green Knight, with my machine gun here to fight. My head is made of iron and my body's made of steel. My britches are made of hardware, and anytime there's a battle on, I'm ready for the field. You don't believe the words I say, enter in Prince George and he'll clear the way.
Here comes I, Prince George, from England I have came. I've fought in France and I've fought in Spain, I don't give a damn, I'll fight again. If Ireland's right and England's wrong, where's the man before me stand?
I'm the man before you,
And who are you, sir?
I'm the Turkish champion.
Where are you from, sir?
I come all the way from Turkey to fight you, sir. I'm here to fight you, sir.
Right your sword.
Friend, what have you done? Look, you've just been playing my only son.
He challenged me for the fight with my right sword. I couldn't break him. That's why he's lying on the floor tonight.
Oh, where's the duck that do the fight? To cure this man that lies on the ground.
Here comes my old Dr. Brownlight, the best old doctor to be found.
How you doing, doctor?
Have you got problems?
Yes, very bad
What's happened? Tragic accident here.
Before you start, what can you do?
I can cure all plagues, the plague within, the plague without, the palsy or the gout. If there's 9 devils in, I can knock 10 out.
Well, that's not bad going.
Yes.
Do you use a plaster on cases like this, doctor?
It's a bad case now, his pulse has stopped.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. I'll use the rue, the crew, and the filly, the fee, and the heart's blood of a bumby. The oil of a zambuck, and the sweat of a tough bank, and the goose's leg, and the wild duck's egg, and the heart's blood of a cold potato.
Yeah.
All these things mixed together, put into a blather, and stirred up with a green cat's feather. You rub that on him hot and cold, as hot as he can throw, and if you don't have a cured man before day, I'll ask no pay.
Oh, you'll get your pay, doctor. Don't be worrying about that.
Oh, now you said that before, and I didn't get it.
Oh, but it's as good as money in the bank, doctor.
Oh, how do you do? I have a little bottle here in the waistbands of my breeches called Hocus Cum Pocus, the Isle of Champagne. Rise up, dead man, and fight again.
Once I was dead, but now I'm alive. God bless the wee doctor that made me survive, hey. And if you don't believe these words, I say, after an old Belgian bump, he's out there. He'll clear away.
Here comes I, we found you both. And over my shoulder I carry a slope. And in my hand a triple pound. I'll take myself off funny me on. You don't believe the words I say. After that big head, and he'll clear the way.
Here comes I haven't come yet. Big head and little wet. My head is big and my body small. I'll do my best to please you all. If you don't believe the words I say, old Hector leads the way.
Here comes I, Earl Hector. Earl Hector, the devil's sister's son. And if I could get an old doll about 410, Delma would bring her for a bit of a run. And if you don't believe the words I say, enter in devil doubt, and he'll soon clear the way.
Here comes our devil doubt. If I don't get money, I'll sweep you all out. Money I want and money I crave. If I don't get money, I'll sweep you to your grave. And if you don't believe the words I say, enter in friendly funny, and he'll clear the way.
Here comes I, wee fiddly funny. I'm the man collects the money. All silver, no brass. Bad money not pass. I have a big jar under my arm. A couple of bob will do no harm. And after that, your pleasure.
Music, please.